I read a quote that said, people travel all over the world, but come home to find what they're looking for. Home. It's comfort. It's your place. It's your space. It's family. It's friends. It's you. And we all have different definitions of home, but when you find your definition of home, it's something special that you treasure forever. I know that I'm about to celebrate 20 years in my home. And I'm somebody that hasn't gone far from home. My mom and dad's place is a 10-minute walk from where I'm sitting right now. My mom just celebrated 50 years there, a place I moved into when I was just a baby at 1 year old. I still live in the old neighborhood, and my children go to my former schools. I'm blessed that my home is so close to my original home. Thus, the courage it takes for somebody to go find a new home, especially far away and in a different country, has always inspired me. Canada is a nation that was originally home to our First Nations sisters and brothers. And then over the past 400 years, has become home to millions of people who have come from all over the world. My wife's mom and dad, Tom and Christine Hunter, were born in 1940 in Edinburgh, Scotland. Met as 17-year-olds and got married, starting a young family with my brother-in-law, Paul, and my sister-in-law, Lynn. And 50 years ago this year, decided to make Canada their home, coming to Canada in 1971. Why did Tom and Christine bring their family to Canada? The same reason that for 400 years, individuals and families have come from the world to our country to seek freedom, hope, opportunity, a better place for themselves, their family, their children, their grandchildren. And with each new arrival, Canada gets a little bit better. I think of my in-laws and how within 2 years of arriving in Canada, they adopted my brother-in-law, David, who was 6 years old and in foster care, giving him a great new home. And then in 1976, I feel giving the world their best gift, my wife. And their family of 4 is complete. But then the family grew. And now Tom and Christine have 11 grandchildren. My eldest daughter is Torry, born in 2005. Torry spelled Torry, which is the Scottish boys' way of spelling that name. We spell it that way because she's named after my wife's grandfather, my father-in-law's dad, Thomas Torry Hunter. When World War II was declared in September of 1939, my wife's grandfather, Thomas, and his wife, Janet, often named Jenny, had 2 daughters, Edith and Jeanette. And then in June of 1940, my father-in-law, Tom, was added to the family. You know, Thomas supported the family as a house painter. And I just I'm amazed at the courage, the sacrifice of Thomas and so many other men and women who have made a decision to leave their home, to leave their family, to defend the lives, families, and homes of others. And in the case of Thomas, in 1941, joining the British Expeditionary Force to go to the literal other side of the world, to the country of Malaysia in Southeast Asia and the island of Singapore, to defend it from the invading Imperial Japanese forces. You know, back in 2016, we were doing our biannual visit to see my wife's extended family in Scotland. And we were sitting with Auntie Jeanette. I asked Auntie Jeanette, what does she recall of that day that her father left for Singapore? And even though it was almost 80 years ago, tears came to Auntie Jeanette's eyes as she recalled how precocious and unaware she was as a 5-year-old, that she was so insistent on getting a pair of red boots that she had seen in a store, crying that she wanted these red boots. And she recalls that the last thing her dad said in front of her was, looking at her mom, and said, "And now, Jenny, make sure you get Jeanette those red boots." The Battle of Singapore in early 1942 would go down as the greatest military defeat in the history of the United Kingdom. 8,000 men were killed in the battle, and 130,000 soldiers were captured. And of those 130,000, more than 1/3 did not survive World War II because of the deplorable conditions in the prisoner of war camps. Thomas Torry Hunter, according to the British War Office, was one of the 8,000 killed in that battle, defending the homes and freedom of those thousands of miles from his own home. We are blessed to have named our child in honor of him. And when you see this picture, taken a year after the Battle of Singapore, think of the powerful duality in this picture. On the one hand, as you look at the 3-year-old, 7-year-old, and 11-year-old children with their mom, it's sad because you know somebody's missing. That at Remembrance Day, we got to remember that for every man or woman that does not come home, a family is left behind. A home is missing somebody. But at the same time, this picture is inspiring because my wife's grandmother, Jenny, raised 3 phenomenal, giving children who gave the world 3 inspiring families, and that Thomas and Jenny would be proud of the contributions of their families to the world that we have today. This powerful picture, taken in the fall of 2005, shows 4 generations of my wife's family. My daughter, Torry, aged 5 months, my wife, Liz, her father, Tom, and a plaque located at St. Giles Cathedral in downtown Edinburgh, Scotland, the plaque honoring 5 soldiers who were part of the same troop killed at the Battle of Singapore. One of those men, Tom's father, Thomas Torry Anderson Hunter. We remember. My middle name is Ross, and thanks to marrying into a Scottish family, I've discovered my own Scottish roots and my connection to Clan Ross. You see, the Scots associate their families in clans, and clans have their own tartan, traditions, area of Scotland that they're from. My mom's great-grandfather was a Ross from Tain in Scotland, and it's been fun to discover my Scottish roots. In 2005, Clan Ross Canada, we received an email from a Stephen Duff, a retired Toronto-based teacher who had written a book about a Dr. Alexander Milton Ross. He had written a fictional book based on the real-life story of this amazing Canadian, and he titled the book Hunter of Dreams, a story of the Underground Railroad. Stephen hoped that our association would use some of the funds and influence to honor this amazing Canadian. Now, like most of you, I had never heard of this man. Born in 1832, died in 1902, but when I learned his story, I truly realized he is one of our country's greatest heroes of the 19th century. It took 4 years, but in 2009 in Chatham, Ontario, we erected this gorgeous plaque in the Freedom Park, which was created by the Chatham-Kent Black Historical Society. When we approached the Black Historical Society in 2006 about working with them to honor Dr. Ross, they were just thrilled. Gwen Robinson, who was then the president of the association, said, and I quote, "Dr. Ross is my favorite Canadian." Why? Dr. Ross was a highly esteemed expert in insects and birds, in addition to being a medical doctor after getting his medical degree in New York City. So in the 1850s, he was a teenager and in his 20s, and after reading the book Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, he was inspired to commit his life to abolishing slavery in the U.S. South. So while based in New York City, this Canadian, born in Belleville, made several trips into the Deep South. Now, using his connections as a Mason is a society of gifted and obviously many times well-established and wealthy tradespeople. As a Mason, and under the guise of studying local birds, Dr. Ross would visit plantations and be taken in as a guest for several days by the plantation owners because most of them were Masons. In reality, he was secretly meeting with slaves and giving them maps and directions on how to escape to Canada, using routes that had safe houses and stores of food. It was incredibly dangerous work, as anybody caught helping slaves would be put to death. As Gwen Robinson from the Chatham-Kent Black Historical Society told me, "Can you imagine the courage of a white Canadian risking his life and his career as a doctor to travel into the Deep South in his 20s so that people like my great-great-grandparents could find freedom in Canada?" Gwen said, "I would not be here if it weren't for him and many others who helped out along the Underground Railroad." Escaping slaves were told, "Travel by night and follow the North Star to Canada, to freedom, to a new home. Now, I had a policy as a student leader, both when I was a high school student president and an orientation week coordinator at King's College, Western University. I had this policy, go big or go home. And that is, how can we make an activity or an event as inclusive as possible? Get out as many people, make sure it's as accepting and as fun for as many people as possible. And it's something I've continued to this day. What can we do to make it better? So in 2006, when I was in charge of this weekend to honor Dr. Alexander Milton Ross, where our clan association members from across Canada would meet in London, but spend the Saturday visiting different Underground Railroad sites in the Chatham-Kent area, I thought, you want to make this really special? If we could find the descendants of Dr. Alexander Ross and invite them as guests of honor as we have a weekend celebrating his life and contributions. And thanks to author Stephen Duff, he had been in contact with two of Alexander Ross's great-granddaughters who are now living in England. And so what a thrill that Janet and Jillian, pictured here with myself in the Dresden, Ontario newspaper, when the local paper profiled our Clan Ross Association visiting the world-famous Uncle Tom's Cabin National Historic Site, located in Dresden, Ontario, about 20 minutes north of Chatham, Ontario, about 45 minutes west of where I am here in London. This area a key destination on the Underground Railroad. You see, the book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, was inspired by the true life of Josiah Henson. Josiah Henson, who was a minister, an abolitionist, an escaped slave, an educator, fled the U.S. South, came to the Chatham-Kent County area of southwestern Ontario, and established what was called the Dawn Settlement, D-A-W-N, that became a refuge for those coming from the U.S. South. Having read his memoirs, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which in the mid-1800s was the #1 selling book and the very first ever bestseller, even outselling the Bible. And that book, read by Dr. Alexander Milton Ross and many others, was one of the keys to the eventual abolition of slavery, as it brought to the masses the true experiences of what was happening in the U.S. South. For Janet and Jillian, they were just so appreciative to be invited to a weekend to honor their great-grandfather and to meet the descendants of those that traversed the Underground Railroad and to see how far they had come in establishing a beautiful new home in Canada. It's amazing what can happen when you are inclusive, you invite people, and you figure out ways. How can we make this better? And I'm so glad we took a lot of effort to track down Janet and Jillian. In fact, it was my first phone call with them that brings us to the conclusion of this story. It was June of 2005. We were beginning the process of planning the 2006 National Gathering and the exploration of the Underground Railroad. I had Jillian's phone number in the UK. I call her. I'm talking with her on the phone. She had that fantastic Queen Elizabeth UK accent. And I was saying to Jillian, oh, how thrilled we would be if her and her sister would be our guest of honor with any other family members they wanted to bring as we honored their ancestors. And then it happened, an emotional moment I will never forget. I said to Jillian, "Have you ever been to Canada before?" And she said, "Oh, yes, we had to live there during World War II. The word had sticked out. I said, "Had to live?" I asked. "Yes," said Jillian. "My father was an accountant with the British government in Singapore. When the Japanese army invaded, my family escaped to Canada via Australia, and we lived in British Columbia for over 3 years." I was speechless. "Andrew, are you there?" said Jillian. Stunned at the connection, I said to Jillian, "My wife's grandfather, my father-in-law's dad, died in the Battle of Singapore. My newborn baby, Torry, is named after him." Now was her time to be silent. And in an emotional voice, Jillian from her home in England said, "Tell your wife that her grandfather and men like him saved our lives. Tell your wife that my father literally got on the last boat that left Singapore. And in fact, it remained so dangerous for him. He never did leave Australia and spent all of the war in Australia while my mom and 2 sisters remained in Victoria, British Columbia. Those soldiers fought so that as many civilians as possible could escape to freedom." And how powerful is that? That in 2006, my father-in-law got to meet Janet and Jillian and give a hug to 2 women whose family was saved by the sacrifices of his father.